Welcome to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. On today's show, Dr. Joe Myers and I discuss the wave of social unrest and race riots that swept the country during the summer of 1967. How did hot weather play a role in leaving a lasting mark on one of America's most popular cities? Plus, what if more progress had been made toward racial equality before 1967 and the riots never happened? It's one of the questions we answer in our segment, What If? And as we look back at the long, hot summer of 1967, our planet is now warming at a rapid pace. We'll take a closer look. It all starts now on Invisible Iceberg.
Four days of rioting, looting, and arson rocked the city of Detroit in the worst outbreak of urban racial violence this year.
It can be described as one of the darkest times in American history. A mix of heat and a lack of progress in race relations sparked a deadly wave of riots during the summer of 1967. One of the cities at the center of this long, hot summer is Detroit. The events of July 23rd left a lasting mark on the Motor City. But does hot weather really cause people to lose their cool? It's one of the fascinating stories in the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History. Joining me now to help us delve deeper into the heat and summer riots is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. Dr. Joel, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure being here again.
All right, let's talk about it. A historic event happened in the summer of 1967.
It did. Actually, there were over 160 riots in different cities across the United States in that summer. So clearly there were things going on politically and socially that set the stage for that unrest. The Civil Rights Act had just passed a few years earlier.
This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country,
making it hopeful for blacks that there was going to be progress, but very little had yet occurred. And there was a lot of racism that existed, particularly in the police forces. Most of the police force in those days were all white. And so that set the stage for this riot in Detroit, where it was a complete white police force came into a black neighborhood on a hot, humid situation that was just primed for an explosion.
Well, you mentioned a little bit about the weather. How much of a role do you think the weather played in this?
I think it played a significant role. I mean, it was a hot, humid day, a hot, humid evening. The real field temperature, the AccuWeather real field temperature was in the 90s. In those days, most people didn't have air conditioning. Or if they did, it was a window air conditioning. It was no such thing as central air was rare. And so particularly in the poor neighborhoods or in some of the black neighborhoods, in this neighborhood in particular where this erupted, there was very little air conditioning. And buildings build up the heat. So even though it was in the evening and the night, the air temperature was falling somewhat, into the 80s, it still was very hot. So people had windows open, trying to get any breath of air. So they also heard any commotion that was going on. So the police, for some reason, raided this bar that was supposedly illegal, where a lot of it was segregated, so it was almost entirely blacks in the bar, and so for some reason the police decided to arrest all of them, 90 some, and they only had a handful of policemen, so they called for more police to come. And in the meantime, this riot broke out as people came out of their buildings because they were awakened and awake from all this commotion, and it turned into a terrible riot that burned down parts of Detroit and destroyed a lot of businesses, and it was a tragedy.
Why does heat make people angrier?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, as your body heats up, the same what's released by your brain that tries to cool your body is the same chemicals that cause you to lose your temper more easily. It's been shown that as it gets hot and humid and so on, people are more impatient. They have little tolerance for disagreement, and actually are more prone to violence, more likely to condone violence, more likely to participate in it. Now, it's interesting that where that threshold is varies. In Los Angeles, studies show that this effect of violence starts at 85 degrees. But in more northern cities like Minneapolis, it may start at 80 degrees. In the tropics, where people are more used to it, it may be at a higher temperature before this occurs. So it does vary around the world and with different climates. So, that's part of it. But then finally, when it gets so hot, people just want to
Get out of the heat. Yeah.
Get out of the heat. They have no energy to go fight. So there's an area there where violence is more likely, certain temperature range.
Fascinating information. A sad time in American history, but it's an amazing story. Thanks for telling it, Dr. Joel.
You're very welcome.
All right. Here with more perspective on this moment in history is Mark Atwood Lawrence. He is the director of the LBJ Presidential Library in Austin, Texas. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
All right, during the summer of 1967, what was causing the riots and civil unrest in urban communities?
Well, it's a great question, because let's remember in 1964 and 1965, Lyndon Johnson and Congress had passed two of the most important civil rights advances in all of American history, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So it seemed to a lot of Americans as though the nation was finally reckoning with the problem of race and making bold progress. And then all of a sudden in 1965, and then especially 1966, and above all 1967, you see this surge of unrest in America's cities, and nowhere more so than Detroit. And I think what this indicated to people at the time, and certainly we can see this even more clearly with the benefit of all the hindsight that we have available to us now, the civil rights advances of the mid-1960s only really scratched the surface of the indignities that many Black Americans experienced in their day-to-day lives.
As the closer one arrives to achieving entree into the old power structure, the more forced the confrontation becomes. The lines become drawn.
In Detroit, what you see is that perfect storm of police abuse, of a basic lack of economic opportunity in many American inner cities, and so many of the other problems that simply couldn't be wiped away even through the boldest legislation.
In the White House, what led to President Johnson's decision to send federal troops to Detroit?
We sent federal troops, I think, because of a sense that Michigan authorities may not be able to control this rapidly evolving situation all by themselves. Now, Governor Romney did in fact send Michigan State Police, Michigan National Guard, but he requested that the White House deploy U.S. troops as well to supplement what Michigan authorities were able to come up with on their own. I think, though, there's a couple of other factors that certainly weighed on Lyndon Johnson's mind beyond simply the challenges of what was taking place in the streets of Detroit. For one thing, LBJ by 1967 was under enormous political pressure to project an attitude of law and order. A lot of Americans were growing increasingly concerned about unrest in America's cities. The Republican Party was certainly emphasizing its dedication to law and order. And so Lyndon Johnson himself had to kind of get on that same program. And so dispatching U.S. forces into the city of Detroit was a way to demonstrate that.
Later, President Johnson established the Kerner Commission. What was the mission and the conclusion of the task force?
So the mission of the Kerner Commission that was put together in 1967 was to try to understand the root causes of urban unrest that played out so spectacularly in Detroit and so many other cities, and to make recommendations about what the federal government could do to address those underlying problems. And what the Kerner Commission, after about 7 months of study, concluded was something that was very uncomfortable to a lot of white Americans. Essentially, Black Americans were responding to an increasingly desperate situation in which they felt a almost total lack of economic opportunity, a lack of respect and dignity in American society. People want to understand the basic story of how these events played out, just as they want to understand what drove these events in the first place.
Mark Edward Lawrence, director of the LBJ Presidential Library in Austin, Texas. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Coming up later, we'll take a look at the threat of global warming. But next, we take a closer look at why 1967 may have been a prime year for riots and social unrest in cities across the United States. We'll also look at another notable riot and the actions then President Lyndon Johnson took after this very violent summer. Invisible Iceberg returns after a quick break. Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. It's time for our segment, What If? We're looking at the first city that was a powder keg for simmering social unrest during the long, hot summer of 1967. Joining me again is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book, Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. Let's go back to 1967. If we had the information now that we had, or the information then that we have now, could this have been predicted that there would be a high threat for riots during this day?
Well, part of predicting such a thing, and of course we're in the prediction business at AccuWeather, is the social situation, the politics, the background, and we're not experts in that. But just from the weather standpoint, we do know the range of temperatures, humidities, the real field temperature that is most likely to cause riots. So using the correlations that can be derived now from the AccuWeather historic database, that correlation, predictive analytics that a lot of companies use our database for, and then using our forecast, can actually predict a lot of things, many things. So it shouldn't have been a surprise, given the expectation that it was going to be a hot summer against the background of the politics that existed at the time. So to some degree, some of this could have been predicted, yes.
We talk about this a lot at AccuWeather. During heat waves, it's just not the temperature during the afternoon, is it? It's that temperature at night that never drops, that if you don't have air conditioning, it just keeps everything warm, right?
The human body, you can take a day of heat.
Right.
And humidity is something very important too, and that's reflected and other things in the real field temperature. That's the uniqueness about the patented real field temperature we have, because it takes account of 12 different factors. It's not just the temperature, it's not just the humidity, it's not just the wind, although all contribute. So it's all these things, and as it builds up, as you go to your second, your third, particularly fourth, fifth, sixth day, like the heat wave counter index that AccuWeather invented, the longer it goes on, the more agitated people get.
Let's talk about the what if. What if this didn't happen in Detroit? Or what if, let's say, it wasn't hot that day, or we didn't have that long, hot summer? How things would have been different, not only in Detroit, but for the country. Any speculation on that?
Well, it is pure speculation. We know there were over 150 riots across the country in different cities. Newark had a bad riot weeks before the one in Detroit. It was a hot summer, but the politics, there was a lot of racism still, even though the Civil Rights Act had been passed and the heat and humidity, where there was little air conditioning, not widespread like it is today. And so once you had riots in one city and it became on the news regularly, it set the stage. And with hot heat and humidity and lack of air conditioning and the political environment, unrest over the Vietnam War, and unrest over racism, there was a lot of anger in the country. So as a result of that, President Johnson, who took over after JFK had been assassinated, was expected, he won re-election in '64 in a landslide. He was expected to win in '68, so he could run twice, because he took over as being vice president. So he could run in '64 and he won. expected to run in '68, but after these riots across the country and the Vietnam War causing more and more turbulence, he lost. He decided he wasn't going to run because the handwriting was on the wall.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
And Richard Nixon became president in 1969, won the election. Now, you look back, Richard Nixon lost the presidency to JFK in 1960. He tried to run for the governorship of California in 1962, and he lost that. And so everybody figured his political career was over. But he won the presidency in 1969. In fact, after he lost the gubernatorial race in 1962, he met with the press and he was sort of bitter, and he said, "You won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore." He was done. And yet he became president 7 years later because of all this unrest across the country, and particularly the long, hot summer of 1967.
And again, when you look at the temperature, 86 degrees for the high, 73 degrees for the low, certainly uncomfortable. But I think that this is a classic example of why we created the AccuWeather real field temperature, to get a better idea on how this feels. And this is a classic example because we went back and did the research. The AccuWeather real field temperature in the middle 90s, so 11 degrees higher than the high temperature.
Right, so in the city, it probably was a few degrees higher than 86 anyway, temperature-wise, but that's right. There was no wind, very high humidity, very high, just very stuffy, and in the buildings, it was very hot because it had been several days of hot weather, so absolutely, you're right. It was a lack of air conditioning, and the heat had built up, and day after day, people have less and less tolerance for that kind of heat.
And again, it's the heat that helped cause, unfortunately, this tragedy that, again, changed the city of Detroit and the nation for years to come.
Yes, it did.
It's just yet another fascinating story. Thanks, Dr. Joel, for telling it to us.
You're very welcome.
All right. I want to thank AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book, Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. Again, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
All right.
Great being with you.
All right, coming up next, is the planet warming up at a rapid pace? We'll take a closer look when Invisible Iceberg returns. Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. Heat is a profound danger to people. In fact, according to the World Health Organization, heat stress is the leading cause of weather-related deaths and can exacerbate underlying illnesses. While the number of people exposed to extreme heat is rapidly growing due to the climate change in all regions of the world, large cities are especially vulnerable to the forces of climate change due to their urban heat island effect. Heat islands are urbanized areas that experience higher temperatures than outlying areas, sometimes 5 to 20 degrees higher. They are created by the combination of large concrete buildings, blacktop roads, warm exhaust, and lack of greenery. Climate change is a compounding factor by worsening and sustaining the heat. Detroit, for example, averages 5 more heat waves per year, while heat waves last 1 to 2 days longer compared to the early 1960s. This added heat results in an increased demand of electricity and air conditioning, which can lead to brownouts, promotes more air pollution, while warmer water from city runoff worsens water quality. AccuWeather's position on climate change unequivocally states that the evidence is clear. There can be little doubt that humans are contributing to global warming and continue to influence the world's climate. AccuWeather has also joined organizations around the world in signing the Global Climate Science Media Action Pledge, which affirms that climate change is real, dangerous, and already causing damage, and that climate change is a top priority for the signatory organizations. I want to thank AccuWeather founder and executive chairman, Dr. Joel Myers, for joining us today. And a big thanks to all of you for watching. We look forward to seeing you next time.